When did you realize that a psychopath obsessed with you? I noticed my new coworker Madeline was eating the exact same lunch as me for the 14th day in a row. Turkey avocado wrap? I asked, holding up my identical one. She smiled brightly. Great minds think alike. It seemed harmless at first. We'd started at the marketing firm the same week, and Madeline was friendly enough. But over the next month, the coincidences piled up. She bought the same mint green water bottle I'd had for years, started using my specific coffee creamer, wore a dress exactly like mine, just in different colors. That's such a cute cardigan, our manager said to Madeline one morning. Very Anna's style. Madeline beamed. She inspired me. Anna has such great taste. I forced a smile, but something felt off. When I switched to salads for lunch, so did Madeline. When I mentioned loving true crime podcasts, she suddenly became obsessed with the same ones. She'd even started using my specific phrases like, "That's a spicy take," and my nervous laugh. Things escalated when I ran into Madeline at my hair salon. She was in the chair next to mine, showing my stylist a photo. "I want this exact color and cut," she said, then noticed me. "Oh, Anna, what a coincidence." But the photo was of me. One from our company website. She was literally showing my stylist a picture of my hair to copy. I left before seeing the results, but the next Monday, Madeline walked in with my exact hairstyle and color. "Don't we look like sisters now?" she asked, twirling. My coworkers joked about us being twins. Some found it endearing how much Madeline admired me. But I started documenting everything. She'd bought my exact car model in the same color, moved to an apartment 3 blocks from mine, joined my gym. The breaking point came when I saw her at a cafe with someone. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. She was with Bryce, my ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago, the one who'd broken my heart. They were laughing, holding hands, clearly together. "Anna," Madeline waved me over. "You remember Bryce, right? We met on a dating app. Such a small world." Bryce looked uncomfortable but played along. I muttered something about being late and fled. It couldn't be coincidence. Seattle was too big for her to randomly match with my ex. She had to have sought him out specifically. I started digging into Madeline's background. Her social media only went back 6 months. No college friends, no family photos, no history. Her references checked out, but when I called the companies directly, no one remembered her beyond confirming employment dates. Then I found her old Instagram under a different name, June Landry. The photos showed a completely different person. Brunette, different style, different life. But the transformation was documented. Slowly, over months, June had changed. Dyed hair lighter in stages, lost weight, changed her wardrobe. The last posts were from 8 months ago, showing her outside my apartment building, outside my gym, at my favorite restaurants. She'd been stalking me for months before applying to my company. I confronted her in the parking lot after work. "I know you've been following me. I know you targeted Bryce. What do you want?" Madeline's bright smile faltered. For a moment, something darker flashed across her face. Then the smile returned, wider than before. "I just admire you so much. You have the perfect life. This isn't admiration, it's stalking. I'm going to HR. With what proof? That I have good taste? That I happen to match with your ex? That's not illegal, Anna." She was right. Nothing she'd done was technically criminal, just deeply unsettling. I went to HR anyway, but they said without evidence of actual harassment, they couldn't act on someone having similar preferences. I started changing everything. New routes to work, new coffee shops, different gym times. But Madeline adapted, always finding ways to intersect with my life. Bryce broke up with her after I warned him, but she didn't seem upset, like dating him had just been another box to check. One night I came home to find a package at my door. No return address. Inside was a photo album. The first pages showed recent pictures. Me at work, at the store, walking my dog. Normal surveillance photos. But as I flipped through, they got older. Photos of me in college, in high school, at family gatherings, birthday parties as a child. Pictures I'd never seen before, taken from angles that meant someone had been there, watching, documenting my entire life. The last page had a single photo. 2 babies in a hospital nursery. The label read, "Baby A and Baby B, St. Mary's Hospital, April 23rd, 1992. My birthday, my hospital. My phone rang. Madeline. "Did you get my gift?" "What is this? What's Baby B?" "You don't remember because you were too young. But I remember everything." What she said next changed everything I thought I ever knew. Madeline's voice came through the phone, shaky but certain. Our mother lied about having twins. I had a sister who was given away at birth. She'd been searching for me her whole life, following leads through adoption registries and hospital records until she found me. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The album slipped from my lap and hit the floor. I told her we needed to talk in person right away because this changed everything I thought I knew about my family. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop the next day, but after I hung up, I couldn't move from my couch. The photo of those 2 babies stared up at me from the floor. Baby A and Baby B. One of them was me. Was the other one really Madeline? I spent the entire night unable to sleep. I pulled up every baby photo I had on my laptop, comparing them to the nursery picture in the album. The timeline matched my birthday exactly. April 23rd, 1992. St. Mary's Hospital. The same hospital my mom always told me about. I started questioning whether my whole childhood was built on a lie my parents told me. Had they really given away my twin sister? Why would they do that? I searched online for information about separated twins and found hundreds of stories about siblings reunited after decades apart. Some of them looked identical even though they'd never met. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My voice sounded weird on the phone, like I was underwater. I got in my car and started driving to my parents' house 2 hours away without even texting them first. My mom answered the door in her bathrobe, hair messy, clearly surprised to see me standing there at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. I held up the nursery photo without saying hello. I asked her to explain what baby B meant. My mother's face went completely white when she saw the photo. She grabbed the doorframe like she might fall over. Then she walked to the couch and sat down heavily. She kept saying there was never a twin, that I was a singleton birth, just one baby. But her hands were shaking and she wouldn't look at me. I pushed harder. I showed her the surveillance photos from the album, pictures of me from my entire life taken by someone who'd been watching me. I explained everything Madeline had done over the past months. The copying, the stalking, the fake coincidences, dating Bryce. My mother's face changed as I talked. She finally admitted there was a complication during pregnancy. Early ultrasounds showed 2 heartbeats, but one stopped developing in the first trimester. She said the doctors called it vanishing twin syndrome. It happens in many pregnancies, more common than people think. One twin just stops growing and the tissue gets absorbed. She never told me because it felt like mourning a baby that never really existed. I felt angry that she'd kept this secret my whole life, but I also understood her pain. Still, this didn't explain Madeline's certainty. If the twin died before birth, how could Madeline be that baby? My mom insisted no baby was given away, that I was the only child born that day. I left my parents' house more confused than when I arrived. Back in Seattle, I knew I needed legal help. I found Emmett Aguilar online, an attorney who specialized in harassment cases. His office was downtown in a tall building with glass walls. I laid out everything that had happened, showing him the timeline of Madeline's behavior. He listened carefully, taking notes. He examined the photo album, flipping through pages of surveillance pictures. He said we needed to document every interaction going forward, because this crossed into criminal stalking territory. Emmett explained that the nursery photo could be from any hospital. Baby A and Baby B were standard labels for twins everywhere. Madeline could have found a generic photo online and changed the date and hospital name to manufacture this connection. He said people with obsessive disorders sometimes created elaborate false narratives to justify their behavior. He advised getting a restraining order right away and filing a police report. I filed a detailed police report that same afternoon. I brought printed photos showing the car match, proof of the apartment proximity, screenshots of June Landry's old Instagram showing the surveillance. I also brought Bryce's contact information. The detective, a tired-looking woman named Daniels, took it all seriously. She said stalking cases were hard to prosecute without direct threats. Copying someone's life wasn't technically illegal in Washington state, but the pattern of behavior combined with the manufactured twin story might be enough for a restraining order. She told me to keep documenting everything. I called Bryce that evening. He sounded uncomfortable when he heard my voice, probably feeling guilty about dating Madeline. I explained what I'd learned about her real identity as June Landry and the stalking pattern. He went quiet for a long time. Then he agreed to provide a written statement about how Madeline had specifically sought him out. He admitted she'd asked mutual friends about my dating history before matching with him on the app. During their brief relationship, she'd asked constant questions about me, about my habits and preferences and past. He said he felt manipulated and used, that the whole thing disturbed him now that he understood what was really happening. He'd send the statement to Detective Daniels by the end of the week. I thanked him and hung up. For the first time since finding that album, I felt like I was taking real action instead of just reacting to Madeline's moves. 2 days later, I walked back into the office and everything looked the same but felt completely different. The open workspace layout that used to feel modern and collaborative now felt exposed. I could see Madeline across the room at her desk, typing away like nothing had happened. She glanced up, caught my eye, and smiled this bright, friendly smile. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater almost identical to one I'd worn last week. My hands clenched around my bag strap, and I had to force myself to walk to my desk instead of screaming at her in front of everyone. How could she act so normal? How could she smile at me like we were friends after everything she'd done? I sat down and opened my laptop, trying to focus on emails, but I could feel her watching me. Every few minutes, I'd look up and catch her staring before she'd quickly look away. My coworkers chatted around me about weekend plans and upcoming projects, totally unaware that the woman 3 desks over had been stalking me for months. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone what she really was, but I knew how that would look. I'd be the crazy one making accusations while Madeline played innocent. Instead, I kept my head down and counted the hours until I could leave. Around noon, I met with Emmett at his office downtown. He'd already drafted the restraining order petition and walked me through each section. The court hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which felt like forever. But he said that was actually fast for the system. He coached me on how to present the evidence, telling me to stay calm and factual. He said judges see emotion as unreliable, that I needed to focus on the pattern of behavior with dates and documentation. When I mentioned the twin claim, he shook his head and told me not to lead with that. He said it sounded too strange without proof, that the judge might think I was exaggerating or unstable. Better to stick with the concrete facts. The surveillance photos, the car and apartment proximity, the targeting of Bryce, the workplace copying. Those were provable and disturbing enough on their own. I nodded and took notes, trying to memorize his advice. He told me to practice telling my story without getting emotional, to treat it like a work presentation. I left his office feeling more prepared but also exhausted by the idea of performing calmness when I felt anything but calm inside. That afternoon, I decided I needed to verify the hospital records myself. If Madeline had somehow found real evidence of a twin, I needed to know. I called St. Mary's Hospital and asked for the records department. A woman named Catherine Neal answered and listened patiently as I explained I needed my birth records from 1992. She told me those records were stored in microfiche format because they were over 30 years old. She said I'd need my mother's written consent to access them since it was a non-emergency request. I thanked her and hung up, then stared at my phone for a long time before calling my mom. The conversation went about as well as I expected. She got defensive immediately, asking why I was still pursuing this when she'd already told me the truth. Her voice had that tight, hurt quality that made me feel guilty, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I explained as calmly as I could that I needed concrete proof to show the police and the court. Madeline had built this entire false story, and I needed official documentation to debunk it with facts. My mother went quiet for a moment, then asked what I planned to do with the records once I had them. I told her they'd only go to my lawyer and the court, that this was about legal protection, not family drama. She finally agreed to sign the consent form, but made me promise not to share whatever I found with my aunts or cousins or anyone else in the family. I promised, though I didn't fully understand why it mattered so much to her. As I drove to my parents' house the next day to get her signature, I started to realize something. My mother had been carrying shame about that early pregnancy complication for over 30 years. She'd treated the vanishing twin like a personal failure, something to hide rather than a common medical thing that happened to lots of women. She'd never talked about it, never processed it, just buried it deep and tried to forget. And now I was forcing her to dig it all back up and put her signature on official forms. I felt bad about that, but I also needed those records. She signed the consent form at the kitchen table without looking at me, her hand shaking slightly. I thanked her and left quickly, not wanting to drag out the uncomfortable moment. While I waited for the hospital to process the records request, I ordered a DNA test kit online, the kind you see advertised everywhere, where you spit in a tube and mail it back. I knew Madeline probably wouldn't agree to test too, but I wanted my genetic profile on file. If she ever tried to claim we matched through some fake results, I'd have my own official data to contradict her. The kit arrived 2 days later and I completed it that same evening, sealing the tube and dropping it in the mail the next morning. It felt good to take another concrete step, to gather more proof that would eventually shut down her delusion. Emmett had also recommended a private investigator named Yang Benedict, who specialized in online research and digital footprints. He said Yang could find information that regular people missed, the kind of deep background that might explain who Madeline really was. I called Yang and explained the situation, sending him everything I had on June Landry. He said he'd start digging and get back to me within a week. His fee was steep, but I didn't care at that point. I needed answers, and I needed someone with actual skills to find them. Yang called me 6 days later with information that changed everything. He'd found that June Landry had lived in Portland 2 years ago, and had done almost the exact same thing to a woman named Rachel. She'd copied Rachel's appearance and lifestyle for 6 months, following her around, showing up at her regular places. Rachel had eventually gotten a restraining order and moved away suddenly, probably to escape the situation. Yang had found the court records in Oregon and sent me copies. Reading through Rachel's petition felt like looking in a mirror. The same pattern of behavior, the same gradual transformation, the same obsessive fixation. The only difference was Rachel had acted faster, getting legal protection before it escalated as far as my situation had. This discovery hit me in 2 completely opposite ways at once. Part of me felt relieved because it proved I wasn't special, that Madeline's twin story was complete fiction. I wasn't her actual sister, just her latest target. She'd picked me the same way she'd picked Rachel and probably others before that. But I also felt horrified because it meant she was deeply mentally ill in a way that wouldn't just go away. This wasn't about actually finding a lost sister. This was a pattern she repeated over and over, fixating on women and transforming herself into them. Even if I proved we weren't related, even if I got the restraining order, she'd probably just move on to someone new eventually. The thought of another woman going through this made me feel sick. The next day at work, Madeline cornered me in the break room. I'd gone to make coffee and she appeared in the doorway blocking my exit. She asked why I was avoiding her, her voice soft and hurt. She said she thought I'd be happy to find my sister, that we could finally be a real family. Her eyes had this desperate, intense look that made my skin crawl. I could see she really believed what she was saying, or had convinced herself so thoroughly that the delusion had become her reality. I set down my coffee mug and looked at her directly. I told her firmly that we were not sisters, that I had proof we weren't related, and she needed to stop contacting me immediately. My voice came out steadier than I felt inside. She started to respond, but I walked past her, shoulder brushing against hers as I squeezed through the doorway. My heart pounded as I returned to my desk, half expecting her to follow me, but she didn't. I sat down and forced myself to breathe normally, to focus on my computer screen, to act like I wasn't completely rattled by the encounter. That afternoon, Madeline showed up at my desk with red, puffy eyes. She stood there crying, saying our mother had lied to both of us, that she'd been adopted out as a baby and spent years searching for her biological family. Her voice got louder as she talked about feeling abandoned and rejected, about finally finding me only to have me push her away. Several coworkers looked over and I could feel their judgment settling on me like weight. One guy from accounting walked past and gave me this dirty look, like I was some heartless person refusing to accept my long-lost sister. Madeline kept going, her performance getting more dramatic, talking about growing up alone, wondering where she came from. I sat frozen at my computer, not knowing what to say, aware that anything I did would make me look worse. She finally walked away, wiping her eyes, leaving me sitting there feeling like the bad guy, even though I knew she was lying. 2 weeks later, the restraining order hearing arrived. I sat in the courtroom with all my evidence organized in folders, the photo album, the Instagram screenshots showing her transformation from June to my copy, the timeline of her surveillance. Emmett sat next to me looking calm and professional. Madeline sat across the room with her lawyer and she looked small and confused, like she couldn't understand why any of this was happening. When the judge called us forward, I presented everything step by step. I showed the photos of her following me, the documentation of her copying my car and apartment location, the statement from Bryce about being deliberately targeted. I kept my voice steady and factual, just laying out what happened without emotion. Madeline's lawyer stood up and argued that his client simply admired my style, that coworkers often influence each other's choices. He said the twin theory was a sincere belief based on the hospital photo she'd found online, that she genuinely thought we were related and was hurt by my rejection. He made it sound like a sad misunderstanding instead of months of calculated stalking. The judge listened to both sides, flipping through the evidence. He looked at Madeline for a long moment, then back at the papers. He granted a temporary restraining order requiring her to stay 50 feet away from me outside of work, but he said he couldn't control workplace proximity since we both worked for the same company and had a right to our jobs. He ordered her to stop all personal contact, no calls, no emails, no approaching me at work beyond what was absolutely necessary for job duties. He warned that violations would result in arrest. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something official, something documented. Madeline's face crumpled when he read the order and she started crying again. Her lawyer put his hand on her shoulder. I just felt exhausted. The day after the hearing, HR called me into a conference room. The representative sat across from me with a serious expression and said they were taking the situation seriously now that there was a court order involved. They'd decided to move Madeline to a different team on another floor, and I'd report to a different manager to minimize our contact. But they were clear that they couldn't fire her without evidence of actual workplace misconduct, that having similar taste and a restraining order weren't grounds for termination under company policy. I understood the legal limitations, but felt frustrated that she got to stay while I had to change my whole work structure. They assured me they'd monitor the situation closely and act immediately if she violated the order at work. 3 days later, my phone rang during lunch. It was Catherine from the hospital records department. She said the microfiche records were ready for review, and I needed to come in person to view them. I drove to the hospital that afternoon, my stomach tight with nerves. Part of me was scared I'd find something that proved Madeline right, even though all the evidence said she was lying. The hospital archives were in the basement, a quiet room full of old filing cabinets and microfiche machines. Catherine met me there, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. She pulled out the film reels and loaded them into the machine. The birth records appeared on the screen in grainy black and white. I leaned forward, reading through my mother's admission papers. The early pregnancy notes mentioned a suspected twin based on the initial ultrasound. My heart jumped when I saw that. But then the delivery record clearly stated singleton birth with no problems. There was a note in the margin about vanishing twin syndrome in the first trimester, exactly what my mother had told me. I sat back, feeling relief wash through me. The medical records backed up her story completely. I asked Catherine if there was any possibility of a baby being switched or given away without the mother knowing. She shook her head and explained that modern hospital protocols made that basically impossible. Babies got ID bracelets immediately after birth, mothers had matching bracelets, and nurses checked them constantly. She said even in 1992, the systems were pretty good. Then she mentioned Betty, a retired labor and delivery nurse who'd worked at the hospital back then. She said Betty might remember unusual cases or could at least explain how things worked in that era. Catherine wrote down Betty's phone number for me. I called Betty that evening and she agreed to meet me the next day at a coffee shop near her house. When I walked in, I spotted her right away, a grandmother type with silver hair and a warm smile. She waved me over to her table and ordered us both coffee. I pulled out the nursery photo and slid it across to her. She picked it up carefully, holding it close to study the details. Her face got thoughtful as she examined it. She said the labeling system looked right for that time period, but something about the image quality seemed wrong to her. Betty explained that in 1992, the hospital used Polaroid cameras for all nursery photos. The pictures had a specific look and texture that this image didn't match. She turned it over, checking the back, then held it up to the light. She said it looked like it had been printed from a digital file, that the resolution and color quality were too clean for a 30-year-old Polaroid. She suspected someone had either manipulated an old photo or downloaded a generic twin photo from the internet and relabeled it to match my birth date and hospital. The more she talked, the more confident she sounded. This wasn't an authentic hospital photo from 1992. Then Betty told me about an incident she remembered from that year. 2 babies had their ID bracelets temporarily mixed up during a shift change. It only lasted a few minutes before alert staff caught the mistake and fixed it. She said the hospital had implemented new protocols because of that scare, adding extra checks and verification steps. But both babies went home with their correct parents. There was never an actual switch. She remembered it clearly because it had scared everyone so badly, made them all more careful. She patted my hand and said she was certain no baby had been given away or switched at the hospital without proper documentation and consent. Back at my apartment that evening, I scanned all the hospital documents and emailed them to Emmett along with Betty's contact information in case he needed to verify anything. He called me back within an hour and said this was exactly what we needed for the permanent restraining order hearing. The medical records proved there was never a twin, and Betty's expert opinion about the fake photo would destroy Madeline's entire story in court. I felt more confident than I had in weeks knowing we had solid evidence instead of just my word against hers. 2 days later, a small package arrived from the DNA testing company I'd ordered from online. I opened it at my kitchen table and read through the instructions carefully. The cheek swab was simple enough, just rubbing the cotton stick inside my mouth for 30 seconds on each side. I knew Madeline would never agree to test herself, but I wanted my genetic profile documented officially. If she ever tried to claim we matched through some fake results or forged documents, I'd have proof of my real DNA on file with a legitimate company. I sealed the sample in the prepaid envelope and dropped it in the mailbox on my way to work the next morning. That afternoon, Yang sent me his complete report on June Landry, and I sat in my car in the parking garage reading through it before going into the office. My hands started shaking by the second page. She'd used 3 different identities in the past 5 years, and each time she'd picked a woman to fixate on and gradually transformed herself to match them. There was June Landry in Portland with Rachel, but before that she'd been Michelle Torres in Sacramento, copying a woman named Sophie for 8 months. Before that, she was Amber Payne in San Diego, fixating on someone named Kayla. The pattern was identical every time. New city, new name, pick a target, study everything about her life, change her appearance, get close to her, then escalate when the target noticed and got scared. Yang had included photos from each identity, and watching June transform from one person to another was genuinely creepy. She had no stable sense of self, just borrowed whoever she decided to become next. The report showed that each fixation ended the same way too. The target would either move away to escape her or get legal protection, and then June would disappear for a few months before popping up in a new city with a new name and a new target. She'd done this at least 3 times that Yang could document, maybe more that he couldn't find records for. I read his conclusion twice to make sure I understood it correctly. The restraining order wasn't going to stop her permanently. It might make her move on to someone else, but she wouldn't stop this pattern just because a court told her to. I needed to prepare for the possibility that she'd keep trying to get to me for years, maybe forever. The next Monday at work, I spotted Madeline watching me from across the open workspace floor. She was at her new desk assignment, far enough away to technically follow the 50-foot rule from the temporary restraining order, but she'd positioned her chair so she had a clear view of my area. Every time I looked up from my computer, she was staring, not even trying to hide it, just sitting there with her hands folded on her desk, eyes locked on me like I was the most interesting thing in the world. My skin crawled every single time I caught her doing it. I tried moving to a different desk for the afternoon, but she adjusted her position to keep watching. I told myself she was testing the boundaries, seeing what she could get away with, but it still made me want to scream. My manager noticed me looking uncomfortable and called me into her office around 3. She closed the door and asked if Madeline was bothering me despite the team reassignment. I explained about the staring and how she kept positioning herself to watch me. My manager frowned and said she'd talk to HR about it, but in the meantime, she suggested I work from home 2 days a week to reduce the contact. I could pick which days worked best for my schedule. I thanked her for the flexibility, genuinely grateful that someone at work was taking this seriously, but I also felt frustrated that I was the one adjusting my life and changing my routine, while Madeline got to stay in the office acting like some kind of victim whose sister was rejecting her. 3 weeks after the temporary restraining order was issued, I got an email from Madeline to my work address. The subject line said, "Proof we're sisters," and my stomach dropped when I saw her name. I didn't open it. I immediately forwarded the entire thing to Emmett, and then sent a separate copy to the detective handling my case. Any contact from her was prohibited under the restraining order terms, even work email. The message itself talked about finding new evidence and wanting to share it with me, but I didn't read the details. I just wanted it documented that she'd violated the order. The detective called me back that afternoon and said they'd issue Madeline a warning. Her lawyer would probably claim it was work-related and sent by accident, which is exactly what happened. When the police contacted her, her lawyer said she'd meant to email someone else about a work project, and autofill had put my address in by mistake. The detective told me this was typical stalker behavior, testing the boundaries to see what they could get away with. He said I should document every single incident no matter how small, because patterns of behavior mattered more than individual events in stalking cases. Keep a detailed log with dates and times and descriptions. Save every email, every text, every interaction. Build the evidence file so when we went back to court for the permanent order, we'd have proof she wasn't going to stop. I started keeping a notebook in my bag specifically for logging Madeline incidents. Every time I saw her watching me at work, I wrote down the date, time, where I was sitting, where she was positioned, how long she stared. When I went to the gym that weekend, the front desk staff pulled me aside and said they needed to talk to me about a member inquiry. Apparently, Madeline had been asking questions about my workout schedule, what times I usually came in, which classes I attended. They'd flagged her membership for suspicious behavior and told her they couldn't share member information. The staff member who told me looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't sure if she was overreacting, but I thanked her for letting me know and added it to my log. Every piece of evidence mattered. That evening, my mother called crying. She said she was sorry for keeping the vanishing twin secret from me all these years and asked if we could repair our relationship. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been thinking about this for days, maybe weeks. I sat on my couch listening to her apologize and felt torn between understanding and hurt. I told her I got why she didn't tell me about the early pregnancy loss, that it made sense she'd want to protect me from something sad that happened before I was even really born. But I was hurt that she wasn't honest when Madeline first showed up with her twin story. If my mother had just told me the truth right away, I could have shut down Madeline's delusion immediately, instead of spending weeks wondering if there was any possibility it was real. My mother cried harder and said she'd been scared and ashamed, that she still felt like she'd failed somehow by not carrying both babies. I told her we needed time to rebuild trust, that I couldn't just pretend everything was fine, but I wanted to work on our relationship. We agreed to talk again in a few days after we both had time to process everything. The next week, Emmett called me into his office to schedule the permanent restraining order hearing. He pulled out his calendar and circled a date 6 weeks away, explaining that was the earliest slot available in the courthouse. He spread out all our evidence across his desk: the Portland restraining order documents, the hospital records showing no twin, the workplace harassment log, the photo album Madeline had sent. He tapped the Portland papers with his pen and said we had an extremely strong case because the pattern proved this wasn't about me specifically. It was about her mental illness finding a new target. The hospital records completely destroyed her twin story, and the documented workplace behavior showed she wouldn't stop even when confronted. He felt confident the judge would grant a long-term order with serious conditions attached. I left his office feeling hopeful for the first time in months, like maybe the legal system could actually protect me from her constant presence in my life. That same afternoon, Yang sent me an urgent email with screenshots attached. He'd been monitoring June Landry's social media accounts under her various names, and she'd started posting vague messages on Facebook about being rejected by her birth family. The posts talked about searching her whole life for her sister, finally finding her, only to be turned away by lies and manipulation. She never mentioned my name directly, but anyone who knew us both would recognize she was talking about me. The posts painted her as this tragic figure desperate for family connection, and several people had commented with sympathy and support. Young said she was clearly building a public story where she was the victim, trying to get ahead of the legal proceedings by controlling the story. He advised me to immediately lock down all my social media accounts, make everything private, and warn my friends and family not to accept friend requests from anyone they didn't know personally. He also suggested I screenshot her posts as evidence of her continuing to push the false twin narrative, even after the hospital records proved otherwise. I spent that evening going through my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, changing every setting to maximum privacy, and blocking anyone I didn't personally know. I sent a group text to my close friends explaining the situation briefly, and asking them to be careful about who they connected with online. My mother called after getting my text, worried about what Madeline might post about our family, and I had to reassure her that nothing she posted could hurt us, because we had the truth and the evidence on our side. The constant vigilance was wearing me down, though, always having to think 3 steps ahead about what Madeline might do next, and I realized I needed professional help dealing with the stress. I found a therapist named Dr. Sarah Payne, who specialized in trauma and stalking cases, and I got an appointment for the following week. Sitting in her office that first session, I poured out everything about Madeline: the copying, the surveillance, the twin delusion, the constant feeling of being watched. Dr. Payne listened carefully and took notes, then said something that shifted my whole perspective on the situation. She explained that Madeline's obsession wasn't really about me as a person, that I just happened to fit whatever psychological need she had for identity and connection. I could have been anyone who matched whatever internal template she was working from. Someone successful and put together on the surface. Someone whose life looked perfect from the outside. Understanding that made it feel less personal somehow. Like I wasn't being targeted for who I actually was, but for who Madeline imagined me to be. That realization made the whole thing more manageable, less like a personal attack, and more like being in the wrong place when someone's mental illness needed an object to fixate on. We worked on strategies for managing the hypervigilance and anxiety, breathing exercises and grounding techniques I could use when I felt overwhelmed by fear. 3 weeks into therapy, the DNA results arrived in my mailbox in a thin envelope. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands, even though I knew what it would say. The ancestry breakdown showed my heritage, mostly Irish and German with some Scandinavian mixed in, exactly what my parents had always told me about our family background. The genetic relatives section confirmed I had no close relatives in their database, no siblings or half-siblings, just some distant cousins scattered across the country. I logged into the genealogy website and uploaded my raw data to 3 different services, hoping to find more distant cousins who might have family trees I could explore. Each site processed my DNA and confirmed the same thing: no close genetic relatives, no secret twin sister out there. I downloaded all the reports and sent them to Emmett to add to our evidence file. One more piece of proof that Madeline's entire story was built on delusion. The 6 weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each day at work, another exercise in avoiding Madeline's stares from across the floor. I kept my therapy appointments and worked on not letting her presence control my emotional state, but it was hard when I could feel her watching me constantly. 2 days before the permanent hearing, I came home from the gym around 8 at night and parked in my usual spot behind my apartment building. I grabbed my gym bag from the trunk and walked toward the back entrance, fishing my keys out of my pocket. Something made me look up at my building. Maybe instinct or just random chance, and I saw her. Madeline was standing across the street, partially hidden by a tree, staring up at my windows. She wasn't trying to approach me or cross the street, just standing there watching my apartment in the growing darkness. My heart started racing and I fumbled with my phone, trying to decide if I should call the police or just get inside quickly. Before I could decide, my neighbor Jeff came out the back door walking his dog. He saw me frozen on the sidewalk and followed my gaze across the street, spotting Madeline immediately. Jeff was a retired cop, and he immediately understood something was wrong. He told me to go inside right now while he kept an eye on her, and I practically ran through the door and up the stairs to my apartment. I watched from my window as Jeff stood outside with his dog, clearly watching Madeline, who remained across the street for another 10 minutes before finally walking away. Jeff called me 5 minutes later and said his doorbell camera had captured the whole thing. 20 minutes of Madeline standing across the street staring at my building. He'd already downloaded the footage and would send it to me right away for my lawyer. I immediately forwarded the video to both Emmett and the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. This was a clear violation of the restraining order, documented proof that she was still stalking me even with a court order in place. The detective called me back within an hour and said the footage was exactly what they needed. Clear video evidence of her violating the 50-foot rule and engaging in surveillance behavior. He said they'd arrest her first thing in the morning, and this would significantly strengthen our case at the permanent hearing. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, convinced Madeline would come back. The next morning, I called in sick to work, unable to face going to the office knowing the police would be arresting her there. Emmett texted me around 11 to say it was done. Madeline had been arrested at her desk and taken to the station for booking. She was released on bail a few hours later, but now she had a criminal charge pending in addition to the civil restraining order case. Emmett said this violation was the best thing that could have happened for our case, even though it was scary for me, because it proved she wouldn't respect court orders and needed stricter monitoring. The permanent hearing was scheduled for 9 the next morning, and I put on my most professional outfit and met Emmett at the courthouse 30 minutes early. We sat in the hallway reviewing our evidence one more time, and I could see Madeline arrive with her lawyer, looking pale and nervous. When the judge called our case, we filed into the courtroom and took our seats at opposite tables. The judge was an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes, and he spent 10 minutes reviewing all the evidence in silence before looking up. He asked Madeline's lawyer to explain the arrest from 2 days ago, and the lawyer tried to argue that Madeline had mental health issues and needed treatment rather than punishment. She claimed Madeline truly believed the twin story and was just trying to connect with family, that her behavior came from a place of confusion rather than malice. The judge listened without expression, then flipped through the Portland restraining order documents and asked why Madeline had done the exact same thing to another woman 2 years ago. Her lawyer had no good answer for that, just repeated that Madeline needed mental health support. The judge looked directly at Madeline and asked if she understood that all medical evidence proved she and I were not related, that the hospital records showed no twin birth, that the DNA results showed no genetic connection. Madeline started crying and insisted our mother had lied, that records could be falsified, that she knew in her heart we were sisters. The judge cut her off and said feelings were not facts, and her pattern of behavior across multiple states showed she was a danger to any woman she fixated on. He granted a 5-year restraining order with strict conditions, including mandatory mental health treatment with a court-approved provider and GPS monitoring for the first year, so the police could track if she violated the distance requirements. He told Madeline directly that if she continued pursuing this delusion about being my sister, she would go to jail, and he was ordering her to have no contact whatsoever. Not in person, not online, not through third parties. The relief that washed over me was so strong I felt dizzy, finally having real legal protection with teeth behind it. After the hearing, Emmett walked me to my car and said this was the best possible outcome, that GPS monitoring meant she couldn't get near me without immediate police notification. The criminal charge would be resolved in a few weeks, probably with probation and mandatory treatment as part of a plea deal. I drove straight to work even though it was almost noon, needing to feel normal again, and found a message from HR asking me to come to their office immediately. The HR director and my manager were both there, and they told me they'd been informed about the permanent restraining order and Madeline's arrest. They said they were terminating her employment effective immediately, that the restraining order combined with the criminal charge gave them clear grounds to fire her for creating an unsafe workplace environment. They apologized for not acting sooner when I first reported the harassment, said they should have taken it more seriously before it got to this point. I thanked them and returned to my desk, looking at the empty space where Madeline used to sit across the floor. Knowing she wouldn't be there anymore felt like a huge weight lifting off my shoulders, not having to see her every day watching me. That evening, I met with Emmett to discuss next steps, and he warned me that losing her job might make her behavior worse rather than better. He said stalkers often got more dangerous when they lost the structured contact of a workplace, when they had nothing but time to obsess. He advised me to install security cameras at my apartment entrance, and to keep varying my routines as much as possible, not to fall into predictable patterns she could track. The GPS monitoring would alert police if she came within 500 feet of my home or work, but I still needed to stay vigilant and aware of my surroundings. I left his office feeling both relieved and anxious, grateful for the legal protections but scared about what Madeline might do next, now that she had nothing left to lose. I installed the security cameras the next day, mounting one above my apartment door and another covering the parking area where I kept my car. The footage uploaded automatically to cloud storage, giving me a record of anyone who came near my space. I tested the motion alerts on my phone, watching myself walk in and out of frame, and felt slightly better knowing I'd have warning if Madeline violated the restraining order. Emmett had been right about needing multiple layers of protection, because legal orders only worked if you could prove they'd been broken. 2 days later, Young sent me an email with the subject line, "New Activity." I opened it at my desk during lunch, scanning through his report about Madeline's recent online behavior. She'd created 3 fake profiles on adoption reunion forums, each with slightly different backstories but all posting the same hospital nursery photo. She was asking if anyone recognized the babies, claiming she was searching for her biological twin sister who'd been separated at birth. The posts were getting responses from well-meaning people suggesting DNA tests and search registries, feeding into her delusion despite the court order explicitly telling her to stop pursuing this fantasy. Yang had flagged the accounts and reported them to the forum administrators, but she could easily create new ones. I forwarded everything to Emmett and the detective, adding more documentation to the growing file of restraining order violations. That evening, I called my mother, something I'd been avoiding since the hearing. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. We talked for almost 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had in years. She told me about the early ultrasound at 8 weeks when the technician found 2 heartbeats, how excited she'd been imagining twins. Then at 12 weeks, only 1 heartbeat remained. The doctor explained that the second embryo had stopped developing, that it happened in many pregnancies, that my body would reabsorb the tissue and I would continue growing healthy and strong. She said the medical term was vanishing twin syndrome, but it felt like losing a real baby to her, like she'd somehow failed by not being able to carry both of us. In 1992, doctors didn't talk about it the way they do now, didn't offer counseling or support groups. She'd processed the loss alone, never even telling my father the full details because she felt ashamed. I listened without interrupting, finally understanding why she'd kept it secret for so long. The shame wasn't about me, it was about her own sense of failure as a mother, even though she'd done nothing wrong. We started having phone calls every Sunday after that. Not long conversations, just checking in and slowly rebuilding trust. She admitted she should have told me the truth when Madeline first appeared, that her defensive reaction came from decades of buried shame rather than wanting to hurt me. I forgave her, really forgave her, because I understood now that she'd been protecting herself from old pain, not deliberately hiding something from me. Our relationship felt different after that, more honest, like we were actually talking to each other instead of performing the roles of mother and daughter. 3 months passed with no sign of Madeline. The GPS monitoring showed she'd stayed away from my home and workplace, and I gradually stopped checking the alerts every few hours. I was sleeping through the night again, not waking up convinced I'd heard someone outside my window. My therapist said I was making good progress, that the hypervigilance was decreasing, that I was rebuilding my sense of safety. I still varied my routes and checked my surroundings, but it felt more like reasonable caution than constant fear. Work felt normal again. My coworkers stopped asking if I was okay, and I could focus on actual projects instead of documenting stalking behavior. Then Yang called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Madeline had moved to San Francisco. He'd tracked her through social media activity and a new address connected to her real name. More concerning, he'd found early signs of her researching someone new. A woman named Sarah who worked in tech, whose Instagram and LinkedIn profiles Madeline had been viewing repeatedly. The pattern was starting again, and I felt sick knowing another person was about to go through what I'd experienced. I asked Yang if there was any way to warn Sarah, but he said contacting her without evidence of current harassment could open me up to legal problems. Madeline could claim I was harassing her by spreading false information about her past. I called Emmett that evening and explained the situation. He listened carefully, then told me something I didn't want to hear but needed to accept. I couldn't control Madeline's future behavior, only protect myself. If Sarah became a victim, she'd have to go through the same process I did, gathering evidence and seeking legal protection. It felt wrong to just watch it happen, but Emmett was right that I couldn't save everyone from Madeline's obsession. The best I could do was make sure my own protection stayed in place and hope the criminal justice system would eventually stop her permanently. I decided to try contacting Rachel, the Portland victim Yang had found during his initial investigation. The restraining order records were public, so I had her full name. I found her on social media and sent a careful message explaining who I was, and that I'd gone through something similar with the same person. She responded within an hour, giving me her phone number and asking me to call. We talked for almost 3 hours that first conversation, comparing our experiences in detail. She was relieved to know it wasn't just her, that Madeline had a clear pattern, that she wasn't crazy for feeling violated even though nothing technically illegal had happened at first. Rachel had moved from Portland specifically to get away from June Landry, changing jobs and losing friends in the process. Hearing that Madeline had moved on to me and now possibly to someone in San Francisco made her angry. We both felt helpless knowing this would probably keep happening unless someone found a way to stop it. Rachel and I met for coffee the following weekend, driving to a neutral location halfway between Seattle and Portland. In person, she looked tired, like the experience had aged her. We spent 4 hours in that coffee shop, going through every detail of what Madeline had done to each of us. The similarities were disturbing. She'd copied Rachel's appearance, joined her gym, moved near her apartment, even dated one of Rachel's ex-boyfriends. The only difference was the twin story. With Rachel, Madeline had claimed they were childhood best friends who'd lost touch, showing manufactured photos of them together that Rachel had never seen before. We realized Madeline adapted her delusion to fit whoever she was targeting, creating whatever backstory would justify the obsession. We decided we needed to document everything in a way that future victims could find, not using Madeline's current name, which could get us sued for defamation, but describing the pattern of behavior in detail. If someone else started experiencing identity stalking and searched online for information, they'd find our stories and realize they weren't alone. We spent the next 2 weeks writing a detailed blog post together. We called it When Admiration Becomes Identity Theft, and described the warning signs, the escalation pattern, the legal steps we'd taken, and the emotional impact. We included advice about documentation, restraining orders, and private investigators. We made it clear this was about a pattern of behavior, not about naming or shaming any specific person. Rachel set up the blog anonymously, and we both promoted it carefully on forums about stalking and harassment. Within a month, we'd gotten messages from 3 other women describing similar experiences with different people, thanking us for making them feel less alone. 6 months after the permanent restraining order, I got a call from the prosecutor handling Madeline's criminal stalking charge. They'd reached a plea deal. Madeline would plead guilty to misdemeanor stalking, receive 3 years of probation, and be required to continue mental health treatment with a court-approved provider. If she violated the probation terms or the restraining order during those 3 years, she'd face jail time. The prosecutor explained that this was actually a good outcome, because it kept her under supervision and gave the court leverage to punish future violations. I signed off on the deal, knowing it was better than risking a trial where she might be acquitted. Around the same time, my manager called me into her office with unexpected news. The company was promoting me to a senior position on a different team, working on major client accounts. It came with a significant raise and my own office instead of the open workspace. My new manager knew nothing about the Madeline situation, which felt like a fresh start. During my first team meeting in the new role, people introduced themselves and talked about their projects, and nobody mentioned stalking or restraining orders or looking over my shoulder. I was just Anna, the new senior account manager with good ideas about marketing strategy. It felt amazing to be recognized for my actual work, instead of being known as the person with the stalker. My relationship with my mother kept improving too. She started opening up about other parts of her pregnancy and early motherhood that she'd never shared before. The difficult labor, the postpartum depression she'd hidden from everyone, the overwhelming fear that she wasn't good enough to be a parent. She talked about her own mother's criticism, the impossible standards she'd tried to meet, the shame she'd carried for decades about normal struggles. The Madeline crisis had somehow forced us both to be honest about painful things we'd avoided, and that honesty made us closer. We weren't just going through the motions of mother and daughter anymore. We were actually connecting as real people who'd both survived difficult experiences. A week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with Betty Compton's return address. Inside was a card with a watercolor lighthouse on the front, and her handwriting filled the inside with a short note about being glad the hospital records helped me get the truth I needed. She'd tucked in a printed flyer for a support group that met monthly at a community center downtown, specifically for people dealing with stalking situations. The meeting times were listed as the 3rd Thursday of each month at 7 p.m., and something about seeing it in print made it feel real and legitimate, like this was an actual thing other people experienced too. I stuck the flyer on my refrigerator and looked at it every morning while making coffee, trying to decide if I was ready to sit in a room and talk about Madeline with strangers. 2 weeks passed before I finally drove to the community center on a Thursday evening, parking 3 blocks away because I was still nervous about someone following me, even though Madeline was legally required to stay away. The meeting room was small with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and about 8 people were already there, ranging from college age to retirement age. A woman with short gray hair welcomed me and said her name was the group facilitator, that everything shared here stayed confidential and I could participate as much or as little as I felt comfortable with. I sat between a young guy in a hoodie and an older woman with a service dog, and listened as people took turns sharing their experiences. One person talked about an ex who showed up at their workplace constantly. Another described a neighbor who photographed them through windows. Someone else explained how a former friend created fake social media accounts to monitor their life. When it was my turn, I summarized the Madeline situation in about 5 minutes, focusing on the copying behavior and the fake twin story, and the restraining order process. Several people nodded like they understood exactly what I meant, and when I finished, the guy in the hoodie said my documentation probably saved me from years of escalation, because most stalkers only stop when they face real legal consequences. The older woman with the service dog mentioned that her stalker had continued for 7 years before she finally got law enforcement to take it seriously, and she wished she'd kept better records from the beginning like I had. Hearing their stories made me realize I'd actually handled the crisis pretty well, instead of being a passive victim who let things happen to me, and that shift in perspective felt important. After the meeting ended, 3 people came up to exchange phone numbers and said I should come back next month, that having a support system of people who actually understood made a huge difference in recovery. The next morning, Yang sent me a final report via encrypted email with his last findings about Madeline's current activities. He'd tracked her to San Francisco, where she'd established a new identity under the name Jessica Winters, working at a tech startup in the financial district. His research showed she'd been following a woman named someone who worked as a software engineer at a major company, showing up at the same coffee shops and joining the same gym. The pattern was identical to what she'd done to me, right down to gradually changing her appearance to match her new target. I stared at the report feeling sick to my stomach, knowing another woman was about to go through exactly what I'd experienced. I called Emmett immediately and asked if I could contact this person directly to warn her, but he said that without concrete evidence of current harassment, I could actually face legal problems for contacting her. He explained that Madeline could claim I was harassing her new target, or interfering with her life, and it might even violate the restraining order terms depending on how a judge interpreted it. I argued that I had proof of her pattern and a responsibility to warn potential victims, but Emmett was firm that legally I needed to stay out of it, unless the woman contacted me first, or unless Madeline violated our restraining order. I spent 2 days feeling terrible about staying silent, imagining this woman noticing weird coincidences and not understanding what was happening yet. Finally, I decided on a compromise that Emmett said was legally safer. I compiled all the court records from my case, Yang's pattern documentation, and the information about the Portland victim into a detailed anonymous report. I included Madeline's current name and location, her previous identities, and the specific behavioral patterns to watch for. Then I submitted it through the San Francisco Police Department's online tip system, flagging it as information about a potential stalking situation. I didn't include my name or direct contact information, just the facts and documentation that might help them recognize the pattern if the new target filed a report. It wasn't perfect, and I had no way to know if they'd even read it or take it seriously, but it was the most I could do without putting myself at legal risk. 1 year after the permanent restraining order was issued, I signed a lease on a new apartment in the Fremont neighborhood, about 4 miles from my old place. I didn't technically need to move since Madeline had left Seattle entirely, but every time I walked into my old apartment, I remembered finding that photo album on my doorstep and seeing her standing across the street staring at my windows. My therapist said moving was a healthy way to reclaim control and create a fresh start, that I didn't have to keep living in a space that carried bad memories just because it was practical. The new place was a second-floor unit in a renovated building with secure entry and a doorbell camera system, plus it had a balcony overlooking a small courtyard garden. I hired movers for the heavy furniture but packed my personal items myself, and during the process I got rid of probably a third of my stuff. Clothes I'd bought during the Madeline period went straight to donation, because I didn't want reminders of that time hanging in my closet. I threw out the mint green water bottle even though it was perfectly functional, along with several other items she'd copied. Moving day was exhausting, but also felt symbolic, like I was physically leaving that chapter of my life behind and stepping into something new. The first week in the new apartment, I decorated it completely differently than my old place. Instead of the neutral grays and whites I'd always chosen before, I painted an accent wall in my bedroom a deep blue color that I'd always secretly loved but thought was too bold. I bought bright yellow curtains for the living room and hung quirky art prints that made me smile instead of safe landscape photos. My furniture arrangement was totally different, with my couch facing the windows instead of the TV, and I set up a reading corner with a comfortable chair and good lighting. Every choice I made was about what I genuinely wanted, rather than what seemed tasteful, or what other people might approve of, and this small act of reclaiming my own preferences felt surprisingly powerful. For years, I'd made decisions based partly on what looked good to others, or what fit some idea of how things should be, and Madeline's copying had made me hyper-aware of my choices in an unhealthy way. Now I was choosing things purely because they made me happy, and my apartment started feeling like an authentic reflection of who I actually was, rather than who I thought I should be. I invited my mother over for dinner once I was settled, and she commented that the place felt more like me than anywhere I'd lived before, more colorful and personal and alive. Around the same time, the DNA genealogy results I'd uploaded to multiple databases started generating matches with distant cousins. I'd been checking periodically for months without much happening, but suddenly I had messages from 3 different people who shared genetic segments with me. One was a woman in Michigan who'd been researching our shared family line for years and had detailed records going back 5 generations. Another was a retired teacher in Oregon who had old family photos and stories about our great-great-grandparents immigrating from Ireland. The third was a younger guy doing his family tree as a hobby who'd found census records and immigration documents I'd never seen. I spent hours video chatting with each of them, learning about branches of my family I'd never known existed, and seeing photographs of ancestors who had my nose or my mother's eyes. They shared digital copies of birth certificates, marriage records, and family Bibles with handwritten genealogy notes, and I started building out a proper family tree with documented evidence for every connection. The Michigan cousin even had a family reunion planned for the following summer, and invited me to attend if I wanted to meet everyone in person. Having this concrete proof of my actual family history felt like the final evidence that Madeline's twin story was complete fiction, and I could close that chapter knowing the truth was documented and verified. There was no secret sister, no conspiracy, no hidden adoption, just a regular family tree that I could trace through public records and genetic testing. 2 years after the day Madeline first copied my lunch order, my life looked completely different in the best possible way. At work, I'd been promoted twice and was now leading a team of 5 people on major client campaigns, and my coworkers knew me for my strategic thinking and creative ideas, rather than as the person who'd had a stalker. My relationship with my mother had transformed into something honest and close, built on actual communication instead of polite distance and unspoken expectations. We talked on the phone twice a week and visited each other monthly, and she'd started therapy herself to work through the shame and grief she'd carried about the pregnancy complications. My therapist said I'd processed the trauma remarkably well, that I'd moved through the standard stages faster than most stalking victims because I'd taken action quickly and built a strong support system. I still had moments of hypervigilance, like checking over my shoulder in parking lots or feeling anxious when someone seemed too interested in my routine, but those moments were getting less frequent and less intense. Every few months, I checked the restraining order registry online to verify it was still active and that Madeline hadn't tried to challenge it, and seeing it listed there gave me a sense of security. She felt like a distant memory now rather than a constant threat, like something that happened to me years ago instead of a present danger. The support group had become a regular part of my monthly routine, and I'd even started co-facilitating some sessions, helping newer members understand the legal process and the importance of documentation. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized I was genuinely happy with my life and who I'd become through this experience. I'd turned into someone who documented evidence carefully, who sought expert help instead of trying to handle everything alone, who trusted legal systems to work even when they moved slowly, and who didn't let fear control my choices. Before Madeline, I'd been someone who avoided conflict and tried to keep everyone happy, who second-guessed my own perceptions and worried about seeming paranoid or dramatic. The stalking situation forced me to trust my instincts, to advocate for myself aggressively, and to prioritize my safety over being polite or likable. My mother said I seemed more confident and self-assured now, more willing to set boundaries and speak up when something bothered me. My friends commented that I seemed more relaxed and authentic, less concerned with maintaining some perfect image, and more focused on actual connections. The whole situation taught me that I was stronger than I thought, that asking for help was smart, not weak, and that sometimes the best outcome wasn't perfect justice, but simply reclaiming your own life and moving forward with confidence. Madeline never faced serious jail time, and she was probably out there fixating on someone new. But I'd built a life I loved and developed skills to protect myself if anything similar ever happened again. I'd learned that documentation was power, that legal systems could work if you knew how to use them, and that recovery was possible even from violations that felt deeply personal and invasive. Most importantly, I'd learned that my life belonged to me, that I got to choose how I presented myself to the world, and that nobody could take that away no matter how hard they tried to copy or control me. That's it for today's story. Notice how having the right experts and systems in place made all the difference? If you found this insightful, subscribe for more practical stories. Later,